I'd like to talk about what some of the relevant similarities and differences are between humans and animals, and then talk about some of the core analysis issues and some basic tools. I'm going to focus on hidden Markov models because I do a lot of hidden Markov modeling because I'm a speech recognition guy, and that's what's used for human speech. And then we're going to talk a little bit about comparing how we could use HMM sort of at a local level versus at more of a macro sequence analysis sort of level. And then I'm going to do a few examples, including a large-scale sort of illustrative example of what like a big system might look like to do a whole soup to nuts sort of acoustic censusing kind of thing using these approaches. So I think most people are familiar with this. Obviously, terrestrial mammals, for the most part, have similar acoustic structures and similar hearing structures, perceptual mechanisms, and similar analysis methods are often applicable. There are some places where there are big differences. Avian species with the syrinx structure that's present. A lot of amphibian species have alternative production mechanisms that are different and produce different kinds of sounds. We shouldn't expect the same sort of analysis techniques to work. Clicks, transients, echolocation, pulses, those kind of things really have different characteristics to them. And there's a lot of difference in temporal patterns and timing in many different species than there are in humans. We have to keep that in mind as well. What is the temporal resolution of the species? And there's a big variance across there. So I want to start with a comparison of elephants and birds. So these are Ortolan buntings versus elephant rumble. If you ever heard of elephant rumble, which is about close to 80% or more of the vocalizations that elephants make. See the time scale at 10 seconds up there versus 1 second, right? And the level of sophistication of what's happening in that vocalization versus the other, and how big a difference that is. So if we want to make a robust analysis framework, a framework that would apply across a wide range of different kinds of species for doing analysis, I think there's some core issues that we need to think about. What are those? The first, I think, is perceptually relevant spectral measures. How are we characterizing the sound? It should not be the same for every species. We should not think about the sound as if it was human sound. Look at it in the same spectrogram with the same window sizes and the same frequency resolution is not a good choice. And so we need to think about what the perceptually relevant measures are. Time alignment in terms of timing patterns, which is why we wind up using hidden Markov models, because they're really robust for time alignment of sounds, and timing variability. Background noise is a huge issue. One of the biggest challenges to effective classification is not the ability of the models to classify, which they do quite well at, but the ability of the models to classify in the terrible environments that you guys work with, right? Where you have signal-to-noise ratios that are horrible, and you don't have labeled data, right? Because you can't ask the animals what they're saying, right? So you really don't have the same kind of labeling ability. So we have to work with a much larger range of background environments. In fact, we spent a lot of time working on signal enhancement when we were doing classification because that was the biggest factor in it. Vocalization overlap, including massive overlap, right? So how do you analyze vocal sequences when you have 1,000 individuals? You know, you can't, right? You don't do the same kind of thing. You need to look at average spectrum sometimes more than you look at timing sequences. And I'm going to show one example of that. And then structural or syntactic sort of aspects of the word. Okay, so I would like to look at different pieces parts of these sounds here. Okay? And look at how big the differences are. So we look at this elephant vocalization, this rumble, how it's sort of one big thing across that whole thing versus one small little thing that's going on out there at like 8.5 seconds. And then within the bunting call, look at how many different levels of analysis really need to be done. We have a syllable, I think this might be CD, I'm not sure, or AB. AAAABB, right, is the kind of pattern you see here. But within an A pattern, there's really multiple things going on, right? And then even within one sort of sweep of that A pattern, there's something happening. And you can really see that right here, right? Do you see the modulation, the energy modulation that's happening inside the call, right? If you really want to get a good match using a call classification algorithm, you have to be able to think at different temporal levels. Okay. So what are the tasks that we're trying to accomplish? This is a big list. I don't need to go through all of them. There's a lot of different tasks, and they're not all going to be solved with the same kind of tools. And so we should think about that. Are we doing classification? Or are we doing detection, which is a different task, right? You're trying to find things in a huge, big, long record, versus verification, where you have some hypothesis you're postulating, you're trying to test it. Are you doing single structure classification, where you have sort of one sweep and you want to recognize is that call type? Or are you doing a more complex structure used in the generic generic version of what complex means, meaning that there's more going on and you have to look at sequences and those kind of things. We do species classification or individual identification. And I'm not talking about signature whistles. I'm talking about individual identification from their vocal patterns, their spectral characteristics. And that is heavily impacted by whether we actually have repertoire knowledge about the species. So if you're doing individual identification, when you know that species repertoire, you can first divide into call types, and then within call types do individual identification. That's a much different task than trying to do individual identification when you don't have that kind of repertoire knowledge. Or maybe such repertoire knowledge just doesn't exist. And then we have unsupervised clustering. I like unsupervised clustering. A lot of the stuff we worked on has to do with censusing sort of things. So how do you take a big record and sort of group how many individuals do you think there are when you may not have any actual individual models? And that is also affected by whether or not you have repertoire information about that species. So these are all different tasks that require different approaches. I'm going to do sort of a quick introduction of basic tools. I think many of you are familiar with these. And then talk a little bit more about hidden Markov models. First, I want to talk about things like spectrogram cross-correlation and match filtering, those kind of techniques. Those are excellent techniques for certain kinds of problems. You just need to understand what kind of problems they're applicable to make sure that they fit well. Bird calls are one of the ones they've been most successful for when you have a regular time structure, right, with not that much timing variability within a call, so that you can just take, I mean, it's a template matching approach. You're taking a thing and you're putting it over the top and convolving it or correlating it and see how well it matches. And as long as there's not much timing variability, that does really, really well. It also needs a pretty good consistent frequency range. And there are, I mean, if you've looked at bird calls across different individuals, they have frequency shifts based on their individual behavior or individual vocal characteristics. That will cause a spectrogram cross-correlation to just blow up as well, and you may need to normalize or figure out ways to address that. If you want to take that and adapt to complex periodic structure, like take a bunch of spectrograms and stitch them together so you have, you know, AAABB, it gets very complicated. It's not really designed to do that in the way that a hidden Markov model is, as I'm going to show. Dynamic time warping was mentioned. That is a good way, in a very simple way, to match a template up against an input in a way that's got a nonlinear time resolution. It's very easy to use and it's simple to do, and it's been very effective for many kinds of vocalizations for animal species. We quit using these years ago for humans, right? Because they weren't easy enough to stitch together to make language, right? We couldn't do it with continuous speech. But when you're doing individual isolated calls, it's a very good tool still to consider. Okay, hidden Markov models are a state machine, right? It's a Markov chain with statistical models underneath it. I've drawn these statistical models sort of as Gaussian mixture models like statistics, but that is changing in terms of what's underneath there. In my field, in human speech processing, growth has been largely incremental for the last 20 to 30 years. We've been using hidden Markov models that long for these things. In the last 5 years, there's been all sorts of changes. I mean, crazy changes. People started replacing statistical models with deep belief networks. Deep learning is a huge topic in my field. Everybody was at all those talks at the signal processing conferences last time. You couldn't even get in, right? Because all of a sudden, we had these incremental gains, and then bang, there's a step, right? Because someone figured out a way to train deep neural networks to do some of these things. Those things impact this field as well. It's just that those also require hard things like hundreds or thousands of hours of labeled training data. Anybody have that? I don't think so. So maybe that's not going to be the way that these things are going to go. But that does keep changing. You know, is it a support vector machine? Is it a neural network? Is it a statistical model? But from a state machine perspective, we are tracking a temporal sequence of a model through its behavior. And I've drawn sort of a vague spectrogram here, but it could really be, think of this as the acoustic signal. And we are tracking the temporal sequence events that happens. And we may be connecting multiple models. So imagine this is one Markov model and this is another Markov model that we're going to stitch together to do this kind of modeling. Here's an illustration of how it addresses a nonlinear time alignment, right? So say that you have a species that, you know, the section at the beginning could be of different lengths. These pieces could be of different lengths. They're not that regular in nature. A hidden Markov model is excellent at aligning states in a maximum likelihood way, right, to figure out what the most likely pattern is and giving you an overall probabilistic match based on that. That's really why they're good, because they can do that. So that's an illustration of that. So I want to talk about HMMs at two levels. First, I want to talk at a little small level. Okay, this is an example of a weird topology HMM that I have used to look at syllables in bird calls that have this warble structure, right? The pulsating energy pattern that's going on here. So you can imagine if you had this kind of pulsating energy pattern that goes up and down, but maintains the same sort of spectral characteristics for a little while, that you could model that with two states, a low energy state and a high energy state, that both have similar spectral characteristic, but energy is also a feature in there, and then it's allowed to repeat. And this is how many times did it repeat. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you know, and you could go through there, and with two states, you could characterize that pattern. I call this a skip back, right, where you're allowed to have a repeat. We don't do this in human speech. We have left to right sequence models in human speech. But you can do other topologies if that's beneficial to a particular species pattern. So you could have a sequence of frequency things that are based, the sequence has to do with time. Whereas in human speech, we may use 3 states to represent a phoneme. With bird calls, we often use 15 to 20 states because there's more of a temporal sequence going on. With the elephants, we were fine with 1 state, right? We used 3 because we could, because we had enough data, but 1 would have done it, right? It would have been enough to characterize that vocalization pattern. So it's good to have a topology and model parameter selection that is tailored to a particular species. Okay, now once you have those models for a particular call, you can group those in ways that represent language structure, right? This is a bird call example because, of course, that's the obvious example. But you can use them to construct sort of a grammar structure that allows you to do this. So, for example, when we have a song type classification using hidden Markov model, we use this kind of topology, where we have all the possible sort of song types down this way, and then the model for those song types, and then inside every one of these nodes is a full HMM that can then be repeated with a single skip back that allows you to repeat that as many times as you want, if that's allowed. Right? You could also have a model, say, for example, there is in Ortolan Bunting, there's H U F where there's only one U. Okay? But there's multiple repeats of H and F, so then you wouldn't have that particular feedback. So you have that structure. You can also incorporate into this type of thing, we'll call this a recognition network that you would put in your classification model. You can incorporate probabilistic arcs on that. You can have weights that allow you to weight things. One of the things that we do in human speech is we have a big old recognition network with many, many possible phoneme sequences with what we call a simple language model, maybe a bigram, right? That kind of a language model. And that gives us as an output, we don't take just the best path through this. We get a lattice or a word graph that comes out of this, and it's a big old answer that says, here are all the possible sequences that have decent acoustic likelihoods. And then we post-process that graph with a language model. Right, that's a more sophisticated language model, maybe a 4-gram, or maybe a some other kind of context-free grammar model that someone has, or something like that. And so you can incorporate language constraints and those kind of structures into a hidden Markov model, but it takes a little work to do that, to set it up carefully. Okay. This is how we stitch those models together. Human language, every phoneme has its own model, and we have context-dependent models, so there's tens of thousands of models. And then they get stitched together with what we call non-emitting states that don't actually align to frames or observations. And by using that, that's basically what allows all these things to hook together this way. Okay, so that's hidden Markov models as a quick intro. I know it's almost lunch, so I don't want to go too long. The importance of feature selection. So these GFCC things here are our Greenwood function capture coefficients, perceptually motivated but capture coefficient things. And we looked at how song type recognition accuracy or individual identification accuracy changed across different features. Right? We were using some other kinds of features like pitch features. E is energy, D is a delta coefficient, that's a change, it's a frame-to-frame change, and A is acceleration, which is a second order change from one frame to the next. And you just don't worry about the individual ones, but look at the numbers that go from the mid-70s to the lower 90s, right? And over here in the 70s and low 80s. That's an individual identification task. it really does matter how you represent the data and what information you have. We have similar pictures for window sizes. Like with the elephants, I think we use 300 millisecond windows. Human speech is typically 20 milliseconds, 15 to 30 maybe range. With the bird songs, we often use 5 millisecond or smaller, right? Sometimes even 2 or 3 millisecond with overlap. So we sometimes use step size of 1 millisecond as we step through these frames, because otherwise you can't capture that energy modulation pattern that's happening at a very, very rapid time scale. So, yes, yes, some. Yeah. Sometimes we just trade one off for the other. Right? When you use shorter windows, you are absolutely losing detailed frequency analysis in terms of how accurate your spectrum really is. Right? So those capture features are representing less information with a smaller window. Right? But if you think the temporal pattern is really important, you make that trade-off. But yeah, you for sure you lose some. Okay, so I've got a few examples of different kinds of tasks. I'm going to do some speaker ID and arousal level here. We'll look at them as we go through. Each one has sort of one picture. Yes, please. Michael. You know what, we usually hand code it. We have looked at methods. I had a student, now this was 5 or 6 years ago, that looked at automatic selection of frame sizes based on some different criteria function, but most of the time we hand choose it. Yeah, based on our feeling for the species, right? So we looked at elephant rumbles and have done some speaker identification work and got in the order of 88% accuracy. Each individual had a hidden Markov model. This is a song type dependent result. So it was based on one type of call within that individual identification. With those same animals, we did, and I wouldn't call this a classification task so much as a hypothesis test. We were looking at the hormonal phases of the animals and wanted to know, do their vocalizations patterns change during the different periods? Now, of course, we weren't trying to identify every individual vocalization as, you know, telling us what the particular luteal phase was, the estrous phase. But we were trying to see, in a larger sense, do they change? And so the question is the accuracy, you know, we have a 3-class accuracy of 76%. From an accuracy perspective, that's not very good. But from a statistical significance perspective, that says, yes, the vocalizations patterns on average are changing during those estrous cycles, right? Mm-hmm. Please.
I'm not quite sure what our input data is. So we have our spectrogram. So are you taking like instantaneous frequency slices?
Okay, the input data kind of goes back to this picture. We would take this picture. We would take time slices depending on what our chosen frame size. So for the elephants, we're talking 300 milliseconds at a time. And then we extract features that are acoustic features. And for the elephants, they were these Greenwood function frequency capture coefficients. Right. So I draw the picture as if it's a spectrogram, but the spectrogram is not the actual input to the hidden Markov model. This is just a picture that everyone recognizes what it's a picture of. Yes. Oh, yes.
Depending on how close or far you are. So how do you decide what you're taking from each vocal?
We just divide it into frames, and in each frame we do an analysis, and that's the acoustic vector.
And the analysis would be like a spectral. That's
Yes, you take you start with a Fourier transform, and the Fourier transform gets converted, and you can think of it if you want. A capture coefficient is basically shape of the spectrum, right? That's a good way to think of it. It's not the spectrum data itself, but it represents the shape of that spectrum. And we do some normalization that has a huge impact. Like, we don't use energy directly. We use normalized energy because, of course, you don't want to be affected by distance to microphone, right? Those kind of things. And so there's some normalization that happens with those as well. Well, it's a vector. Yes. But yes, a single vector. And some of these things that were in that picture, too, like this MN and VN, that's a mean normalization and a variance normalization that's done that allows you to, across multiple utterances, do some other kinds of normalizations of those features. That for some tasks is good and for some tasks is bad. If you're doing individual identification, you're not trying to normalize out individual identity information. If you're doing call classification, you are, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, there was a paper. Okay, it doesn't. The paper doesn't really justify generalizing it to birds. We do anyway. But there's a paper. Was it LePage? Maybe I can't remember. That showed that basically for a wide range of terrestrial mammals that Greedwin function fits quite well. Yes, including the elephant. And there are specific papers for the elephant, but there aren't specific papers for every species, right? Yeah. I could. That paper was my student Clemens' paper in JASA a few years ago, and he had references to justify why we were doing that. Okay. Another test that we looked at was arousal identification in the elephants, and we were trying to classify the level of arousal, emotional arousal, which is a big field, by the way, in human speech right now. Classifying emotional states, you know, you got Siri, it wants to know emotional states. Other tasks require that. So the thing to note here is that the dependency of the model and how specific the model is really affects accuracy. So if we had a broad speaker-independent model for a baseline set of features, we might be at 40% accuracy. But if we made that rank-dependent and then age-dependent and then actually speaker-dependent models and used some features that are a little more directly correlated to emotional state, like jitter and shimmer, which has to do with period-to-period variability of the core frequency, we were up at 80-something% accuracy for those arousal levels, right? So the different Ortolan Buntings. I don't want to go into too much detail because we've talked a lot about the bird stuff, but this is a song type classification task that we got around 90% accuracy on. There are a lot of additional techniques that you can put on the top of this. In human speech recognition, the models are speaker-independent models for speech recognition, but within the first few moments, those models are adapted to each individual speaker, and it's that adaptation of the model to become more speaker-dependent that makes it more accurate. That has basically allowed speech recognition to get into the public domain and function, right? And I had a student that looked at applying those adaptation techniques to the Bunting vocalizations to see how big a difference it made. And so if we have the caller, okay, the flat lines, caller-independent and caller-dependent models are what we were getting. And the problem with caller-dependent models is you often don't have enough data to train them well. So you get better results by taking a caller-independent, speaker-independent model and then adapting it, which can adapt the parts that you have enough data for and not the parts you don't have enough data for. So you see we were at maybe mid-80% up to 87, 88%, but with adaptation, we're now up to maybe 95%. And this was a call-type classifier in this case, right? So there are a lot of more sophisticated adaptation kind of things you can do to improve these results. Sure, please.
What is the difference between supervised and unsupervised?
Supervised has to do with whether you know the transcription for human speech of the adaptation data or you don't. So did a human being look at that adaptation data and confirm the song type so that we knew the adaptation data was labeled correctly? Or did you actually take the speaker-independent result and postulate it or put some kind of confidence measure on it and use it automatically without actually having a human being look at it? So you can do unsupervised adaptation, but unsupervised adaptation has error, right? Because you may be adapting to something that was incorrect, you know. And maybe 20% of the time it's incorrect, right? Okay, this is to get an idea of speaker identification within song type based on number of speakers, going out from a low number of speakers to a high number of speakers, changes that accuracy from in the 95+% down to the 80%. Right? Just to give you a feel for how those look. Okay, another thing that we've done is it's not really an HMM, it's just a statistical model because we made it one state, right? And we used it for tasks where there was heavy overlap, no temporal patterning at all. That actually works quite effectively for things like speaker identification. In human speech, we don't actually use HMMs to do speaker ID. We use Gaussian mixture models because the average spectral patterns do just as well. So temporal information is ignored, and you're just looking at the individual speaker's average characteristics. That can work a lot for different things. Here we were doing stressed versus unstressed poultry. And I assure you that in a chicken barn, there are so many vocalizations, you are not going to pull them out and do some kind of hidden Markov model on top of them. That is not going to function. But we were able to as a function of how long a time we had to listen, right? Down at 10 seconds or below, this was just a few seconds, we're in the 85 to 90% range. Once you get out to where you have a minute of data, right, or 2 minutes of data, you approach 90 to 100% accuracy. And they were looking to be able to monitor their agricultural situation and make sure that the birds were happy, right? A happy chicken is a tasty chicken, apparently. So, okay. So, I would like to draw this in a picture and put together a big scale system. And I mean, like, this is what it would take to do a big thing, right? We have implemented this, but not in real life, right? Not with a real, actual, in situation. But we've taken some sample data and looked at how it works, and I'm going to show you that. So, if you can do song type classification and unsupervised song type clustering, and you can do individual identification, and you can do unsupervised individual clustering, right? And you can match up different clusters with different clusters, and you have a statistical model for population size, you can put all those things together and use a mark-recapture approach with acoustics to try to get a population estimate. So this was a student's PhD work from a few years ago, and he was trying to see, is this really possible? And do we have enough data that we could even test whether this would function? And this is the whole deal of what you would do. And we actually had like 3 or 4 different pictures like this, depending on how much you had to start with. Like, do you have repertoire information with training data for each song type, right? And this is that picture. But we have another picture for where you don't have that, right? And you have to actually try to cluster the songs because you don't have repertoire information. So, if you can do that, you take the training data and build basic song models, and then you split it into songs and build individual models, right? And you have a set of training data. And then you have the censusing data, and you classify by song type, split it up using the song models, and then you cluster into the number of individuals. And then you basically go through 2 steps. You use individual identification to identify which of those birds you already know were there, and which of those individuals you think are new individuals, right? And you need to do that to get the mark-recapture paradigm sort of set up. And so we set up a hypothesis. We took 2 consecutive summers of Ortolan Bunting data and just postulated the first one was the mark and the second one was the recapture paradigm, which wasn't the right time frame, so it really wasn't a correct setup for that. But we tried to make it work. We were using, for unsupervised clustering, we used a technique called Delta BIC. That's Bayesian information criterion, which is an information theoretic approach to figuring out how many clusters there are, right? Because the problem is, where do you stop when you're clustering? So we would, in this case, when we reach the peak Bayesian information criteria, postulate that that was the number of individuals for that group, okay? And because of we were unable to cluster without first dividing into repertoire structure, right, by what song type it was. We've been working on that for years now. I would love to be able to do individual identification without needing to first split into song types. But song types are much more identifiable than individuals. And so if you try to cluster, you're going to cluster by song types first and individuals second. And you need features that are like song type independent. All right, I just had a student last week finish his PhD work on finding features that would be like less song dependent for this kind of task. But so we had to then pull all these things together. So we have all these individual estimates of the number of individuals making these different bird calls. And then we looked at what was the error, because we actually knew they were labeled based on visual identification by the researchers. This was Tomasz Osiaczuk's his Ortolan Bunting data. So we looked at what the estimated population was, what the known population was, and what the errors were, right? And no surprise, we got more accurate results for the songs that were more common, right? And we thought that was pretty decent. That was my sort of overtake on the whole thing. I thought, yeah, that's better than I thought it might have worked, because I had no idea how accurate this thing was going to be. And then we were able to put it together. Now, to do the overall population estimate, you have to match up clusters from one year to clusters from the next year. And so we came up with a maximum likelihood sort of matching between clusters, and this is an illustration of that. Don't try to figure out what those numbers are. But these are actual identified birds from the first data set versus clusters of birds in the second data set to try to match those up. And then once we did that, we would use the mark-recapture model to get the maximum likelihood estimate. And we came out with our total population, in this case, for n equal 100, and you get a probability of presence as a part of that maximum likelihood sort of error. And our results came out way better than they should have. In fact, I hesitate to say because we were within like 1 or 2 birds, 1 or 2 individuals. But I don't really believe that generalizes. I believe we were just lucky, right? So anyway, that's you can imagine that this kind of a structure that would be required to really put a real big-scale system in place, how many different tasks it involves, each of which requires different variables. Those are not all necessarily hidden Markov models. They might be other kinds of models for different things that all need to link together and do it with real, really noisy data, right? So, okay. So, in conclusion, HMMs are a robust framework, I believe, for doing some of these kinds of vocalization analysis. You do have to very carefully think about frame sizes, frame rates, appropriate features, model topology, all those things. None of these things are going to be black box, stick the data in and come out with classifications. The first thing, I teach pattern recognition. The first thing I tell my students is humans are better at it than computers are. So don't think that the computer is going to magically do something for you that you can't differentiate yourself. That is not the way life is, right? But they can do things really fast and save you a lot of time, right? And for that, I'm very grateful. So, and I think there are a lot of opportunities to integrate statistical information and theoretic approaches to really get towards automating some of these larger scale tasks. And that includes not just things like censusing, but say labeling of data, right? If you can have a system that does automated, gives confidence intervals, shows you the picture you really need to look at, right, in order to have sort of a semi-supervised classification method. I mean, you all know how many hours graduate students spend looking at this data, and I think we could be more effective with some of those things. So there you go. Thank you.